So welcome to my session about data serializations and deserializations. So I've been introduced. So I'm Hugo. I'm from France, Paris. This is my cat, Lannister. I acquired 2 months ago. So this talk is about how to serialize data. So I will show you some tools to do that. So what is serializations? So basically, it's the process of translating data structures or object states into a format that you can store and reconstruct later on. So for example, you can use, for example, HTTP messages, like HTTP requests or HTTP responses, are some kind of formats to serialize an HTTP request or an HTTP response. Or when you encode data with, let's say, base64, you are encoding data, and then you can decode it with base64 decoding. Or if you want to encode some object state to XML for SOAP web services, or JSON or YAML, CSV, whatever. These are kind of examples of formats you can use to encode PHP objects. So the most common usages for serializing data are basically storage. You want to store an object, let's say in memory or in a database or in a file. So you will want to serialize it. Or if you want to, let's say, expose a REST API, so you want to expose your data as JSON or as XML. Or you want to use SOAP if you are still using SOAP protocol to expose your objects. So these are kind of examples of data serializations. So in this presentation, I will show you 3 tools. So first, I will focus on PHP native tools you can use for data serialization, so something that you probably already know. And then I will show you the Symphony serializer components, and then a library called JMS Serializer, which performs more advanced use cases. So if you want to serialize data or deserialize data with PHP, you can basically use the PHP built-in function called serialize. So you just give it any type of data, like a number or a string or an object or an array, and then the function will automatically serialize your data structure into a PHP-specific format. So it's a string in the end, but a string that mostly PHP can read for string. So this is fine for basic use cases, but if you really want to then use this format for making, I don't know, some searches, some expressions, it can be difficult to use. But so this is how a data structure is serialized. So you can see we have the type of the data, so integer, double, null, boolean, string, objects, and then you have the value that is serialized. If you want to deserialize, if you want to recover the initial data, you just have to use the unserialize PHP function. You just pass it the string, and then you will get back your initial data structure. So this is fine for simple use cases like arrays or scalar values, but for objects, it's not really the best way to do that. If you want to serialize objects in PHP, you can also use magic methods like sleep or wake up. So the sleep magic function is invoked when you serialize, so when you call the serialize PHP function on a PHP object. And wake up is automatically invoked whenever you deserialize your objects with unserialized PHP function. So for example, we have this class, a connection, which represents a database connection. So we have some properties like user, passwords, data source name, and we have the handle to the connection. So the link property here is it contains a resource. And so you can't serialize a resource in PHP. So if I want to serialize a database connection object, as you can see, my connect method creates a new PDO object. So in this case, it's a PDO object, but PDO is not a serializable kind of object because it contains pointers to a database connection. So what I can do is to just serialize the properties that allows me to then reconnect to my database. So I can just override double_sleep methods, and I just have to return an array which says which of my private properties I want to serialize. So we'll just serialize those properties because they then allow me to reconstruct my PDO instance. And so when I will deserialize the connection, I will just reconnect to my database using my connect method. So this is how to use it. You create the connection object, then you query your database, and at some point you want to serialize this object with PHP. So when invoking serialize function, you get the serialized string to do whatever you want to do with this. You can do whatever you want with this serialized string, and then you want to unserialize this string to recreate your database connection object, which is reconnected to your database. Simple enough. You can also use a serializable interface. I don't remember in which PHP version it has been introduced, something like PHP 5.3 or 5.4, where you have this method, serialize, and you just return the serialized string of this array. So you are free to create an array, and then you just serialize it. And you can also implement the unserialize method, which allows you to unserialize the data and then recreate the state of your object. So it's a different way of using sleep and wake up with an interface. The thing is that you are typing with an interface, so then it's easier for you to, for example, type in this object as an argument of a method, for example. And so PHP also has native supports for JSON, because the PHP built-in format for data serialization is not really easy to use. So you usually want to use a JSON data format. So PHP also has functions like JSON encode, if you want to encode any type of structures like PHP objects or PHP arrays to a JSON string. And then when you have a JSON string, you can decode the JSON string with the JSON decode function. There's also another interface, JSON serializable. If you want to implement this interface for your objects will be automatically encoded or decoded to encoded to JSON when you invoke JSON encode method function on your objects. So this is an example. We have a class called arrayValue, which implements this interface, JSON serializable. And so this object is it just represents a collection, an array. So it's just an array representation, but as an object. So we pass an array of values, and whenever we want to convert this PHP array to a JSON string, when we call this JSON encode function, as the object implements this interface, the JSON serialize method will be automatically invoked on this PHP object. So it's up to you to choose how you want to serialize this object to JSON. So you can just serialize the whole state or just some part of the state of your object. So this is basically what you have in PHP if you want to do serializations with native functions or built-in interfaces. So those tools they work fine for very simple use cases when you just want to serialize just one object, for example. But when you have to deal with very complex object graphs, when you have nested objects into objects, for example, or when you want to be able to just serialize some parts of your objects depending on some context, then it becomes way more complex to use the built-in tools. So we need to instrument PHP to help you make better serialization processes. And so in the Symphony project, we have developed one component, which is called Serializer component. So you can use it. You can download it with Composer. It's a standalone component. So you just grab it with Composer, and then you just have some couple of wiring to achieve, and then you are ready to go to serialize data. And this component is used by many open source projects, like, for example, Drupal 8 is using it for their REST API. So I will give you some overview of how this component works and what you have in this component for data serialization and deserialization. So basically, the Symphony serializer component allows you to turn objects into a specific format, basically XML or JSON. We could use YAML, but we would have to implement the tools. But by default, we can support XML and JSON. And it also allows you to deserialize a string. So it can recreate an object based on a JSON string or an XML string. So this is the internal architecture of this component. It's quite simple, just have a few classes. And so basically you have the object graph you want to serialize. To serialize this object to a JSON or XML string, the serializer first have to normalize these objects. So we have a bunch of normalizers which converts the PHP objects into an array representation. So we have a kind of man-in-the-middle tool which converts the object into an array, and then the array is encoded to JSON or XML. And when you deserialize, we are making the opposite operation. So the string is decoded to an array graph, and then the array is denormalized to a PHP object. So we have JSON normalizers, or we have JSON encoders and XML encoders, and we have normalizers to convert PHP objects to arrays. So when you download this package, the main class is Serializer. As you can see, this class has mainly two methods, serialize and deserialize. Those two methods are final because we don't want you to override those methods. We want the algorithm in these methods to be always executed in the same way. So you can't override those methods, but you can create your custom normalizers and encoders. As you can see, well, it's not here, but in the construct method of this class, you can inject your normalizers and encoders. So you can create custom extension for the serializer. So you usually use the two first methods, but if you just want to normalize or denormalize, or if you just want to encode or decode an array, you can also use the encode decode methods or normalize denormalize methods. So this is an example, very basic example of getting started with this component. Once you have downloaded the serializer with Composer, then you have to create the serializer object initialized with some normalizers and encoders. So in this example, I'm registering a property normalizer, so an object which converts my public properties or private properties to an array. And if I want to support JSON and XML encoding, I will also register two encoders, JSON encoder and XML encoder. And so in the end, using my serializer object, I can just serialize any object graph to JSON or XML. So I will get back the JSON string or XML string. And if I want to recreate the object based on a JSON string or XML string, I can pass the string. I will specify the class the class of the object I want to recreate, and the type of the string, so if it's a JSON string or an XML string that I want to deserialize. So that's simple enough. So this component comes with 4 normalizers by default. The first one, called property normalizer, uses introspection, it uses reflection to introspect the state of your object. And so it reads the private, protected, and public properties of your object to create an array representing the state of your object. There's another one called object normalizer, which is almost the same than property normalizer, except that it uses the Symphony property access component to read the internal state of your object. And this is the one that is used by default in the Symphony framework. And there's another one called getSetMethodNormalizer, which basically calls getter and setter method instead of using reflection to read the object state or recreate the object state. And so you can also create custom normalizers if you want to have special use cases or special normalizing processes. As I showed you, we also support JSON encoding and XML encoding. So you can also create yours. You can create your encoder's implementation. You just have to create classes that implements the corresponding interfaces. And so we have a chain encoder and chain decoder object which chains multiple encoders or decoders. So this tool allows you to perform some basics and more advanced serialization processes. I will show you some examples. Let's say, to get started, we have a class called movie, which represents a movie. So a movie has a name, a title, we have a description, we have a duration, a release date, and so on. And you want to serialize this movie instance. So this is one of my favorite movies, Seven, with Brad Pitt. And so let's say I want to serialize this movie object to JSON or XML. So remember, you have your serializer object ready. You just invoke the serialize method. You give it your object graph to serialize. So I want to serialize this movie object to a JSON string. So I will get my JSON string. And if I want to deserialize it, so I can just call this deserialize method, pass the JSON string, and I want to recreate a new movie instance. So the movie instance will be recreated based on the JSON string or the provided XML string. So by default, it uses property serializations. So in JSON, you will get this output. So you have a JSON object. And as you can see, all the properties of my PHP object are by default converted to a JSON representation. If you want to serialize to XML, this is the default response you will get. You have a response root element, and then all your properties are returned as PHP XML tags. If you want to deserialize, as I explained, you can just pass a JSON encoded string or JSON representation of your movie object. And so the deserialize method of the serializer will recreate this movie instance based on this provided JSON string or XML string. So same for the XML string. So in the end, your movie object, if you print it, as you can see, we have a movie object, and all the properties have been repopulated by the serializer objects. So if you want to create, for example, REST API, so when you expose data, or if you want to support JSON input or XML inputs to recreate instances, this is very easy to achieve with this component. Another cool thing when you use this component is that when you deserialize a string, the component, the serializer, will try to invoke the construct method of your object. And if your construct method takes arguments which variable match the name of the properties, then the serializer will automatically pass the right values in those arguments. So you can easily remap the arguments to your PHP properties. Otherwise, if you don't have any construct method, or if the construct method doesn't map your PHP properties, the serializer will just use introspection to recreate your object. So it will populate the object by using the reflection API of PHP. So if you want to do more advanced serialization processes, this is some examples. By default, the serializer can also invoke your getter method, hisser method, or hasser method. So to do that, you need to register a getSet method normalizer and object normalizer objects. And those two normalizers will be able to invoke your method if they follow these conventions: has something, is something, or get something. So let's say that my movie object has getter method, so get ID, get title, but also an hasser method, has genre, or is released to check if the movie has been released yet. So has those method follows the conventions to have get, has, or is prefixes, then the serializer will automatically invoke those methods. So as you can see, we have this genre attribute, which corresponds to this hasJOR method. And we have the released attribute, which corresponds to isReleased attribute or isReleased method. So this is the output in JSON, and you have the same using XML. The thing is, Boolean values are represented as 0 or 1 strings by default. But sometimes you don't want to serialize everything. You just want to serialize some state of your objects. If you have a REST API, you don't want to expose everything to your clients, to the clients that consumes your API. So you can also tell the serializer to ignore some attributes. So you can configure your getSet method normalizer or any other normalizers to ignore some attributes. So you just specify an array of the attributes you want to not expose. And so in this case, my storage key in my movie object won't be serialized in JSON or XML. It will be ignored by the serializer. Because this property is internal to my application, and I don't want to expose it to the clients. Also, you can change the way you name your properties. As you can see, by default, it takes the name of your PHP properties, and they are automatically converted to the same name attributes in JSON or XML. But maybe you would like to rename the properties you want to expose. So, for example, we saw that by default, the release date tag will be named release date in camel case, in lower camel case. But if you want to have a snake case with underscores, you can use a name converter. So this is a built-in name converter. You can implement your own if you want, if you want to have a different naming, but this is a built-in one. So you just need to register it into your normalizer object, and then you will get a snake case representation of your attributes. So same in JSON and XML. You may also want to prefix all the serialized properties. So you can create your custom name converter. As I said, there's an interface called name converter interface. And so you can create your custom implementation. So this one takes a prefix in its construct method. And I want to attach the prefix when I normalize my objects to an array. So all the properties will be now prefixed with this prefix underscore something. And when I will denormalize, I will remove the prefix to recompute my PHP objects. So if I serialize my movie object, as you can see, all my properties are now prefixed with my movie underscore prefix. So it's super easy to change the way you output your objects. If you are in XML, as you can see, the response tag here, by default it's called response, but of course you can change it if you want. If you want to change this XML root name, when you serialize your movie instance, you can give it an option called XML root node name, and you can change these root node names. So in this way, I want response to be turned to movie, which is more convenient for my XML outputs. I showed you that you can also deserialize the object. So when you use the serializer to deserialize a string, an XML string or a JSON string, it recreates a new instance. But sometimes you would like to have an existing instance and you would like to merge the deserialized object into the object you already have. So you want to deserialize into an existing object. So that's also possible to do that with this serializer component. Instead of creating a new instance, I want to modify this already initialized instance. So as you can see, my movie object takes an ID, the title, and the slug, but the other attributes are not set. And so the string I have here contains the duration and the release date. So I would like those attributes to be populated in this movie existing object. So when I deserialize, I just need to pass a new option called object to populate. You just give it the movie instance. And then instead of creating a new instance, you will automatically populate this movie object. So if you compare movie 1 and movie 2, in the end, this is the same instance in memory. This is the same object. We are just reusing an existing object instead of creating a new one. So now those two attributes will be populated in my existing movie objects. So you can see that the ID, the title, and the slug are still the same. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 7, and 7. And we have populated the duration and release date attributes. And the other attributes remain empty. Now, we saw some very basic examples, but this component can do much more, especially if you have complex object graphs, if you have nested objects. Because so far, I've just serialized a single movie object. But what if we have this kind of data structure? We have a movie object, which has a nested genre object, which is a genre instance. And we have directors. So a movie can be directed by one or many directors. So we have a collection of directors objects. And in this movie, we have actors playing roles. So we have a collection of roles objects. And role objects also have nested actors objects. So when I serialize a movie, I would also like to serialize those nested object graphs. So let's say we have a one-to-one relationship. So a movie has one genre. So this is the category of the movie, which is a thriller, and I want to set the thriller category in my movie. And so I want to serialize my movie to a JSON or XML string. So this is how it's rendered in XML. So as you can see, the genre object is also serialized in the output. Same if you want to serialize in JSON. So we have a genre attribute, which contains a nested JSON representation. And so if you deserialize, it will recreate the genre object, and it will also recreate the movie object automatically. If you have a one-to-many relationship, so movie which has one or many directors, so as you can see, the 7 movie is directed by 2 directors, David Fincher and Arnold Coppelson. So both have names and birth dates. So I'm adding my 2 directors to the movie. And so when I serialize to XML, we have the 2 nested directors objects serialized. And so same if you serialize to JSON. So we have genre, we have the movie information, and then we have directors, which is an array of directors objects. Now the more advanced use case is when you have many-to-many relationships. So remember we have roles, and a role object is a link between a movie and an actor playing a role in this movie. So in this construct method, we have a reference to the movie, and we have a reference to the actor, and the actor plays the character. So I'm populating my movie object with actors. So we have Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. So they are playing roles, so David Mills and William Somerset. And so I want to serialize this movie object to JSON or XML. Can you guess what happens in this case? Yeah. We have an exception. The thing is, we have a circular references because we have movie, which contains roles, and roles contains movies. So when he tries to serialize the movie nested object, then it goes into an infinite loop. Okay? So that's the complex part. But the component can detect those infinite loops. So you can tell the component to stop serializing whenever you are detecting a circular reference. So if you want to handle circular references, that's pretty easy. You can implement a circular reference handler, which is just a callback function. And so whenever you serialize any object in your object graph, you just have to return a unique representation of your object. So you can use an ID or UID or whatever unique string that represents this instance. So that's whenever the serializer serializes this object, it stores the ID in an array, and next time it will check if this object has already been serialized, so that it will not try to reserialize it and go into an infinite loop. So as you can see, we now have the movie object, which contains roles, and in roles we have actor object, but we are not reserializing the movie. We are just redisplaying this unique string we have computed, which is the ID of the movie. You can also create your custom normalizers if you want, for example, to serialize a datetime object. The movie has a release date, and both actors and directors have a birth date and death date. And so, as you can see, we are storing datetime object. So, by default, when you serialize a datetime object, this is what you have. There is a release date, my release date property, which contains a datetime object, and this is the datetime representation in XML or JSON. The thing is, I just want to output the date as year-month-day. So I have to find a way to automatically convert a datetime object to a string representation. So the serializer allows you to register callbacks that will allow you to change the representation of any kind of objects or data structure. So as you can see, when I receive any datetime instance, I will simply reformat the datetime instance as year-month-day. And I want to register this callback for any release date, birthday, or death day properties. So now when I serialize my movie object, the release date, the birth date of any user, and the death dates are also serialized to just year, month, and day representation. We are not serializing the whole datetime object. And so same in JSON. I didn't use them. So you can use custom normalizers. This one, this is a custom normalizer allows you to change the way you represent one single object. For example, for the roles, we don't want to output this movie attribute. Remember, it displays the movie attribute with the ID of the movie. If you want to exclude it in your output, you can create a custom normalizer. So basically, I'm making my role object an implementation of normalizable interface. And so if this object implements this interface, the serializer will automatically invoke the normalize method, which simply returns a normalized representation of my object. So that in the end, I will just normalize ID, character, and actor property in the XML or JSON string. One of the last things that we have introduced in this component is the serialization groups, which allows you to contextualize the way you encode your objects. Because depending on the context, you don't want to expose the same set of data in your output. Let's say you have admin users and you have regular users. Admin users will see more information of the objects, but regular users will just see basic informations. So you can configure the Symphony serializer components to tell how you serialize your properties, so with which group of context you want to serialize the entity. So you can configure those groups with annotations, like I'm showing you, but you can also use YAML configuration if you are more familiar with YAML, or you can also use XML definitions. It's really up to you to choose the format you like the most. I really like annotations because it's much more concise. I'm mixing my config with my PHP code. And so this way, when I serialize or deserialize a string, I just have to specify the group or the groups, can pass many groups, for which I want to serialize this PHP object. So the properties that are not mapped with one of these groups won't be serialized or deserialized with the serializer. So it's really convenient. And in fact, this is also the way we now recommend to ignore attributes. Instead of using this method I've showed you, set ignore attributes, instead we recommend to use groups so that you can decide what you want to expose or not expose in your state. So this is basically what you can do with this serializer component. As you can see, we have many features for handling many use cases. But sometimes you really want to go further. You really have very complex needs in terms of serializations or data serialization. And this component can have limits for real advanced situations. So in the PHP world, there is a library called JMS Serializer you can use as a replacement of the Symphony serializer. And so this component, or this library, has many features internally. So you can configure the way you serialize object with YAML, XML, or annotations mapping. It really handles circular references gracefully. You can integrate it very easily with Symphony or Zen framework or Doctrine. I think there is also some support for Laravel or other PHP frameworks. It can handle versioning. You can tell, for example, I want this property to be serialized until version 1.0 of my API, and I want to serialize another property from version 1.1, for example. So we really have many, many features in this tool, and you can basically serialize or deserialize any complex object graphs. So this is an example with annotation mapping. So you can specify your @serializer annotations. In this case, I'm saying that I want to exclude everything, so I don't want to serialize anything. I will explicitly expose the properties I want to serialize in JSON or XML. And I want the object to be serialized as a movie root element in XML. I'm also specifying the type of the properties using this type annotation, which basically tells how to then unserialize the string. This is the mapping to unserialized data. And I can tell that the ID attribute will not be a tag, but it will be an XML attribute of my root element. And I want the date. As you can see, my release date object, which is a datetime object, will be serialized as year, month, and day. So I just specified this mapping. I have nothing to write, just the mapping. And then when I will serialize, I will get my movie XML representation or movie JSON representation. You can also specify accessors. For example, for my rating attributes, I don't want to directly expose the rating attribute value. I want the serializer to invoke this method, getAverageRating, and to also call the setter method, setAverageRating, whenever we deserialize the object. So you can explicitly tell the serializer to invoke your methods. You can also expose virtual properties. Let's say you want to expose a last rating mark in your JSON or XML output, but in fact this last rating mark is not a real property of your object, it's a method. So you can tell that this method is a virtual property. As you can see, which returns the last rating nodes we have in our rating collection. And I want to serialize this method, or the return value of this method, has last rate. So the property will be called last rate in my JSON or XML output. You can also use groups, like for Symphony Serializer component. We have a Serializer groups annotation, so you can tell that this property will be serialized only if I want to serialize as admin or archives group. Otherwise, this property won't be serialized, it won't be exposed. Also, versioning support is something you may want to do, especially if you are exposing REST APIs. Let's say you have developed a REST API, and in your REST API, you have this attribute called summary in your movie object. And this summary attribute is serialized as the synopsis attribute in your JSON or XML string. But you are serializing it until version 1.0.9.10 of your API. So when the serializer will serialize your object, if the serializer is configured for version 1 or 0.5. something, it will take these attributes. Otherwise, if we are on version 0.9.11 or above, the serializer will automatically take these attributes, these new attributes that you have introduced in your API. So you can choose which attributes you will serialize depending on the version of your API. Again, you can have nested object graph support. So if you have, remember, we have genres, directors, characters. You can explicitly tell that, for example, the genre object is an instance of IMDb model genre objects. That directors is an array collection, so an array collection object, which contains instances of IMDb model directors. So when this tool will deserialize any JSON or XML string, it will recreate directors instances, and it will put them into a new array collection instance. So it recreates the whole complex object graph. So you can do many more things. This is just an overview of what you can do with this library. There's another one. This is the last one I want to introduce, which is called HOS library. This is mostly useful for REST APIs. If you want to create RESTful APIs, which are HOS compliant. So HOS stands for hyperlink, or hypermedia has the engine of application state, which basically allows you to automatically embed metadata in your output, in your JSON or XML output, so that you can easily browse your REST API just by following some kind of links. And this library has been created by William Durand, a French guy. And this library basically extends the JMS Serializer library to allow you to automatically configure hyperlinks in your REST API. So let's say that when you serialize your movie objects, you would also like to include metadatas in the JSON or XML output. For example, you would like to include the link to that movie resource in your REST API. So this self-link refers to, as you can see, we have an expression, so we can write code as a string. And we say that this movie object, the URL to access this movie object is /API/movies/the ID of this object we are serializing. And I also want to embed the link of the relationship. So as my movie object has a reference to a genre object, to a category, I would like to also include the link to the genre category, which is /API/genre/the ID of this genre object, the nested genre object. And I only want to expose this link only if the category is not porn category, because maybe you don't want to expose the porn category if you have a porn category in your website. So when you will serialize with the JMS Serializer, those expressions will be evaluated at runtime. And so this is what you will get in your output. Remember, we have the ID properties, so ID, title, slug, whatever. And we also now embed relationships. We also embed links to browse the API. So we have those metadatas. And as you can see, we have the link of this movie resource, which is /API/movies/42, and the link to browse the genres category, this category. And same for the embedded relationship. As you can see, we embed the genre object. In XML, this is what it provides. You have links references, you have links object. So you can now browse your API as you browse a website by clicking links. If you have a client, you can easily parse your XML string to fetch any link object and basically get those URLs to get the next resource, which is related to this movie object. So in the end, this is my conclusion. I'm just right on time. If you want to serialize objects for very, very simple use cases, you can use PHP built-in functions. Just use JSON encode, JSON decode, or serialize, unserialize if you have very basic needs, because PHP has tool for that. If you have medium use cases or advanced use cases, you can use the Symphony serializer components. And if you really have very complex needs, you really want to create REST APIs with HOS compliance and so on, then you can combine JMS Serializer and the HOS library I've showed you. But as you can see, we now have in PHP, we have tools to make serialization and deserialization processes very easily. You just need to use them with Composer. You just wire the thing all together. And in 10, 15 minutes, you have data serialized to XML or JSON formats. I think, yeah, I'm done just right on time. So thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free.